To feel loved by somebody, whether they're dead or alive, is a powerful thing. And when you have felt love from somebody, and even if they die, that love doesn't die, it just changes.
Hello and welcome. My name is Liz Gleeson and you're listening to Shapes of Grief. Shapes of Grief is a curation of stories from ordinary people on their experience of loss, how their grief impacted them, and what helped them to find their feet again. Loss can really have such a profound effect on our lives, and it is my hope that Shapes of Grief will provide comfort, hope and inspiration to our listeners so that together we can get more comfortable talking about grief. If you like what you hear, please consider becoming a patron of Shapes of Grief on patreon.com. This is a listener-supported podcast, so please do donate, like, share and review. It really does keep us going. For more grief resources and grief support, find and follow us on all the usual social media channels and on shapesofgrief.com.
Helen, I really appreciate you giving up your time. Helen is based in the west of Ireland and works for Cancer Care West. Helen is a psycho-oncologist. Helen, would you tell us what is a psycho-oncologist?
Psycho-oncology is essentially the psychological treatment of the stress caused by a cancer diagnosis. Like, I see both cancer patients and their families and carers, and I work in a very busy service here in Galway City. There are 4 psychologists working, and we have a multidisciplinary team. So that means that we have oncology nurses, psychologists, counsellors, rehab physio, and then various other people coming to give us services like complementary therapy, manual lymphatic drainage. So it's all geared towards treating cancer patients from the time they're diagnosed until the end of their journey with cancer. And so we see people right from the early diagnosis right through to the end of the journey, whether that's complete cure, whether it's that they get cancer back at some time in the future, or perhaps that they have a poor outcome of cancer and they might die. So we see people at every stage in that journey. Yeah, so that's essentially what I do. We offer psychological support. And I suppose with my background in grief counselling and bereavement, like I do tend to think of a cancer diagnosis as a loss. Not a loss in terms of kind of bereavement and death, but a loss in terms of the losses you kind of endure because of the amount of changes that can take place in somebody's life because of a cancer diagnosis. And that's changes in things like, their physical well-being, their psychological well-being, changes in relationships, changes in kind of worries about the future, and particularly changes around the assumptions we make about our lives. So, for example, a lot of people assume that they're healthy today and they will continue to be healthy. And when you get cancer, the first thing that happens is that the assumptions by which you lived by previously might not work anymore. I suppose a lot of our clients would really struggle with kind of the whole thing about just what you said there exactly, that sometimes when people look well on the outside, people tend to think they're well on the inside. And even though, thankfully, cancer is a disease that's becoming more and more seen as a chronic illness, which people live with for a long time, and for a lot of people they could get complete cure from cancer. But I suppose there's a small number of people who really struggle with it. And even people who do well with cancer would say generally that it takes 2 or 3 years to come to terms with a diagnosis. Because for a lot of people, when they're diagnosed initially and they're coping with that illness, there's much medical treatment going on, so they're going for perhaps chemotherapy, going in for surgery, and having radiotherapy, and so there's no time to process what happens to them. And then when all that treatment's over and the doctor says, you've done really well, you're more or less cured, and you're off, you go and live your life. People often don't feel like that, even though they may look well. The doctor has given them this really positive news. But unfortunately for a lot of people, that's when they have to do all the work psychologically, because that's when they have to process what happened to them. And that's when they realise the amount of changes that have taken place. So, for example, you take something very specific like fatigue in cancer. Fatigue is one of the most common outcomes, not of the cancer, but of the treatment. So people who originally may be able to walk, say, for an hour before and really enjoy something like that, or go out and cut the lawn in one go, or do all their housework, now find that they have to pace themselves and really take their time in terms of how they plan. So instead of doing something just on the spur of the moment, now they have to plan everything, and people find those kind of changes really difficult. So a lot of adaptation to cancer that people have to go through over a period of time, and that's really what causes psychological distress, is am I the same person as I was before this happened to me? And of course, to a large extent, people are the same, but there are these subtle changes that happen that people really have to take time to come to terms with. But it's a process.
That would certainly be my experience as well. I find that I often see people who are a year or two after coming through an illness, perhaps finding themselves cancer-free for the first time in a few years, but it's at this time, with the illness behind them, sometimes that the full psychological impact really hits them. And when the events of the illness and the treatment that they've been through really need to be processed, because often during treatment we're just in survival mode. We're getting from one point to another without fully being able to process what exactly is going on.
Yeah, because at the beginning you're very taken up with surviving and being cured and having good outcome medically, but then it's like as time goes on and you get that result, then you start thinking about the other things that we all take for granted. And even things like relationships can come under huge strain with cancer diagnosis, because maybe somebody feels, I didn't get the support I thought I was going to get. Like if I had €1 for every time someone says to me, the people that I thought would best support me kind of disappeared or like weren't available for whatever reason, and the people I thought I could never count on were really stepped up to the mark. So it's a very cancer has an impact on everybody, on the patient first of all, obviously, but also on the people that are in their circle, friends and family.
Yes, you mentioned a word there, Helen, anxiety. And it's certainly a word that comes up very often when we talk about grief. I see it in my private practice all the time, how our nervous systems respond to the loss or to the change that we're going through. And a lot of people would experience acute anxiety following, a diagnosis or a bereavement or a separation. In that case, Helen, how would you support someone who's riddled with anxiety following a diagnosis or following a bereavement? Like, what sort of tools or support would you offer someone who is suffering from anxiety or panic attacks? I mean, it's just so prevalent and common today.
So I suppose anxiety is a very prevalent disease, and I suppose we live in a society that's quite anxious actually all the time, and I suppose there are lots of things going on in the world, and sometimes I think, are we living in a particular era where all this stuff is going on? But I suspect that if you lived into a Second World War, the same things were happening. Maybe what's really different now is we all know about it much quicker, so when something happens, I always think about Sky News. So Sky News tells you what it's going to be doing before it does it, and it reports the news as it happens, and they dissect it afterwards. So there's a lot of news and stuff coming at you, and I actually don't think our psyche is able for that kind of constant barrage of information and opinions, and it's very stressful for a lot of people. And I think I suppose if you look at where does anxiety come from, so we just take grief for example. I suppose the anxiety that's caused by a grief event, whether it's a bereavement or whether it's some other kind of grief that's caused by some life event, I guess I often think that anxiety comes because we all really, in a way, are quite childlike. What I mean by that in this case is that we all love security and continuity. We like to know what's going to happen next. And when your drug is pulled out from under you because something very unexpected happens, so if you take a bereavement, for example, a lot of people, for a long time in bereavement literature, there was kind of a belief there that if you were prepared for someone's death, you were in a safer place. But in fact, the research nowadays tells us very clearly there isn't really very much difference between expecting a death and having a sudden bereavement experience. And the reason for that probably is that I think all deaths are sudden, because even the ones we expect can come unexpectedly, and often people live even longer than maybe you think they're going to live. So I think bereavement and death and loss are very uncertain events in our lives anyway, and I think uncertainty causes anxiety. So the more uncertain you are about what's going on, the less you can rely on the old things that you relied on, so the anxiety goes up. And I guess I suppose you said that, well, how would you help somebody? So I think there's a few things that you do to help somebody. I think, for example, if we're seeing families here, maybe we're expecting a parent maybe to die, cancer, we would often say to them, I suppose just the whole thing about what you want to keep everything the same for these children so nothing changes too much. And it's the same exactly with adults, even though we're talking about children there. Like, you want to keep it much other things the same as possible. So like continuity is really important. And then I also think I have kind of a few stock phrases, I guess, these people. And one of them is, even in the depths of despair, even when you're really anxious, there's a kind of a very sound psychological piece of advice is that when you do something, you feel better. So sometimes I encourage people to do things even though they don't feel great about doing them. That might be something simple as going out for a 10-minute walk, just to go and do it, because being active helps actually funny enough. Nothing lasts forever. I say to people, like, I know this is really bad today and it seems like it's never going to end, but in fact this too will change. It may change, it will change, it won't keep the same shape. So you have to be hopeful that things will get better. I think the encouragement of hope is really important in anxiety, encouraging people to be hopeful that things can get better, even in very small ways. Because when you're really desperate and when you're really at your lowest ebb, you kind of also lose hope, and I think that's a very difficult place for people to be in. So I guess all those kinds of things really help. I think as well, obviously there are some approaches we use with anxiety, like, for example, I suppose the most common one is cognitive behaviour therapy, where we really get people to, I suppose, educate people to really see that a lot of our anxiety comes from our thoughts, and they cause our anxious feelings. So that when you can when you can reframe something and actually see some kind of a different way, or look at it the way maybe somebody else is looking at it, often that reduces the anxiety a bit. But I mean, I think anxiety in grief, particularly early on in grief, is very normal, because we're really anxious because everything seems very different.
Yes, that's so true. And I'm wondering specifically, Helen, also about trauma, where there's been a traumatic death and perhaps someone is stuck in the trauma or the shock of the events, replaying the story over and over again in their mind. Often that's what happens when we've had a traumatic experience.
So I guess there's a few ways of doing that. I mean, I suppose the first thing is to really assess somebody really well and find out, make sure that they're able for the treatment, because sometimes we don't want to do any harm either. So sometimes it's about holding somebody and let them actually just develop a really safe relationship with the person maybe they're seeing for counselling, so that they feel safe to go into that trauma. Because when you have trauma, you're terrified to even look at it, even take it out of its pocket, because you think this is going to overwhelm me and maybe, really do me damage. So I suppose it's just to get a very safe environment to do that in. And I suppose just a very gradual approach as well. I mean, I guess I would use a lot the whole thing about revisiting the trauma in a very safe way. So like maybe getting someone to do some relaxation or visualization first, really before they start, so that they start off in a relaxed state, and then maybe to just gradually get them to revisit that trauma. It's a really good technique called the rewind technique that we use here, and that is for people who have had traumatic experiences and where they have really kind of almost like tending on post-traumatic stress over that. And we often would use that technique because it's a very gentle way of reintroducing them to the trauma of what happened. I guess I would be of the school of psychology that believes that you have to go back and visit that trauma to really get over it. You can't just leave it hanging there, or you can't avoid it, or you can't deny that it's happened, because those things tend not to work. I was working with someone this morning who's very traumatized by the death of one of her children, and I mean, she really has created a probably what we would call a shrine in her house to this person who died, a shrine, so that she only is happy when she's in this room because she feels she's with him. And that's not doing anybody any harm. It probably is doing her other children some harm, since they're happy about that. But I was really trying to gently say this morning, you feel safe in this room because you're with your son. And that's what's going on here. And just really gentle ways saying, like, what would we like to go and do even for 5 minutes, go out of the house and not be in that room, and what would that be like? And just really gradual, because my worry about that she's finding it more and more difficult to leave her house. And so you don't want to develop something else along with the trauma. And it's kind of become well established because she's just started coming for help, and she's had this for about 3 years. So it's to untangle all that stuff and take a while. But yeah, so trauma is a very, I mean, I think all deaths are traumatic, even the ones that seem like they're more normal in inverted commas. Loss as an event in our lives is very traumatic anyway. Even losses that are not permanent can be very traumatic. I mean, if your child leaves home when they're 25 or they move abroad or something, that's trauma, even though that might be for the best for everybody, but you're still traumatized by that loss. So I think trauma can be a constant feature in our lives in some ways, not to the extent that it requires treatment or anything, but just that we are upset, our psyche is upset when something like that happens.
Helen, one of the reasons that I got in touch with you specifically is, well, I know that you're a fountain of wisdom, and I came across an article recently on a mental health website, a good website here in Ireland, and it was about the 5 stages of grief. And I was quite shocked, really, that this very outdated theory is still being written about. Not only was it up on the website, which is quite a prominent one in Ireland, but it's been shared over 1,000 times. And, this did make me balk, and you would know why I would find that concerning, but perhaps a lot of our listeners wouldn't know. And you've a lot of knowledge on different theories of grief. And I'd love you to share some of that wisdom with our listeners today who might find it useful, Helen.
So I guess when I give you a kind of chronological history of where I come from. So when I started off working first in 1979, which is now 40 years ago actually this year, I was very taken with the stages of grief, and I thought it was a fantastic way of approaching the whole thing about helping people who are grieving. And I guess what changed my idea about the stages of grief, and I when I say this, I'm in no way dismissing the work that, for instance, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did, or Colin Murray Parkes, or any of the really well-known authors who were into the stages of grief. But I guess the problem for me was that the clients I was working with weren't relating to the stages. That was a difficulty that I encountered, first of all, because they were saying, I don't want to, I don't feel angry with my person who died, or I don't want to say goodbye to this person. I don't really want to resolve my grief as in it's over. I want to do it some other way. And that led me down the path of really looking at what else was out there in terms of what we knew about grief and loss. And then I came across this really interesting article by Silver and Worthman, which is kind of one of the seminal papers, I would say, in terms of our understanding of loss and grief today. And from that article, I really discovered that there were other ways of looking at grief, and that what the stages of grief taught us, which is this very set, manualized way of going through grief, that actually doesn't work for everybody, and that a lot of people don't fit into that framework. And that really got me thinking. So that led me down a path doing my own research on grief, and I did do a longitudinal study on spousal and partner loss that was published in 1998. I guess from that I was even more convinced than ever that the stages of grief didn't fit a lot of the people that I met in that study or my clients. There were a few things wrong with the stages that I didn't find helpful. The first thing is that it's very prescriptive. So it kind of tells people, these are the stages. You go through them in a linear fashion, that is one after another, and you come out the other end and you're kind of better in inverted commas. And I guess the first thing is that a lot of bereaved clients would identify with the fact that they don't really feel it's linear, and they're back and forth between the feelings all the time. So some days they're angry, some days, they're kind of almost what they would call normal, not too sad. Some days they feel like I can get on with my life. Sometimes they feel like I can never do that. So the stages are very prescriptive. And what really was coming out for me and for a lot of other people that started to read around that time, people like Margaret Strebe, Wolfgang Strebe, people like Robert Niemeyer that I know you have on another interview, they were really saying to us very clearly, there's a very, very varied, very rich variety in how people respond to grief, and they don't really fit in these very strict categories of stages of grief. And that was exactly what I was finding as well. So I guess for that reason I was really, and you said there you found that you found that website, and the stages of grief are prominent on it. And I think they are, because I think that's, if I may dare to say so, I think it's kind of lazy on our part sometimes, because I think it's very easy to have this manual that you follow. And therefore, a lot of people come into us even nowadays and say to me, I found this book on the stages of grief, or my GP said to me, have you heard of the stages of grief? Because if you fit into that neatly, it's very easy. Grief is not an easy place to be. And it's not, there is no one framework that answers all the questions. So for me, grief and the response to grief and bereavement is a very multifaceted, very rich kind of, very much dependent on the individual who's experiencing it. So many things affect grief. There are so many factors, like what kind of relationship did you have with the person who died? How did that person die? Was their death expected? Had you unresolved issues with them? What was your own earliest first experience of grief? There are so many things that affect that grief that we cannot say that out there somewhere, something like the stages of grief is going to fit everyone we meet. That is an unrealistic viewpoint, I would say. So for that reason, I still worry a lot. People say to me, the stage, and actually in saying this, I am also very aware of the fact there are some people from the stages of grief completely fit, and they like that idea. They like that journey through grief. That's very, I follow this structure and I'll come out the other end and I'll be fine. And if that works for you, I'm not being prescriptive and saying they shouldn't work, but I'm certainly saying there is more than just the stages of grief as a way of looking at what we go through when we're grieving. And we all know, everyone listening to this interview today, and ourselves, we've all had our griefs in our lives, and we know what works for us. And actually, I always say to people, you are the expert in your own grief. And as long as you're not harming yourself or anybody else, whatever you're doing is okay. So for example, in Ireland, we've got a tradition of, maybe going to the grave. Some people absolutely find great comfort in going to the grave. Other people don't go near it. Like, they go once when the person is buried and never go back. There is no right way to be in grief. And that's why, for me, the stages are too prescriptive. It's like this journey you follow, and you don't do it this way. The really difficult thing about the stages is that it's not so much your advice to do it that way, But if you're not doing it that way, there's something wrong with you. So it makes your grief in some or other abnormal, which I think is a terrible shame, because there are very few abnormal griefs that are of that nature. Of course, people get stuck in their grief all the time, and they get stuck in it for the facts that I talked about there. Something in their story has made them have this unique response to loss. But the idea that if you follow the stages, you'll be better, and if you don't follow them, there's something wrong with you, I find that very difficult for a lot of grieving people. And actually, I find it really difficult for the people I meet. I work every day and have met for the last 40 years almost, that they are very clearly saying to me, this is not what it was like. But having said that, I'm very mindful of the fact that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote Stages, because she was actually very instrumental in bringing attention to that whole area of life that had been really up to that time, kind of forgotten about.
Yes, it's also important to say that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote the Stages for terminally ill people who were dying, people who were coming to terms with the end of their life. The Stages theory was never meant for bereavement. And I did hear that she was quite upset that they were applied to bereavement because it was never her intention. And she got quite a lot of slating about the stages of grief. Although she'd never written about stages of grief, she'd written about stages of coming to terms with terminal illness.
Yes, because in the last book that she published with David Kessler before she died, she talked about the fact that she'd never meant them to be for bereavement. Although I suppose as they got adapted into the whole grief response over time. And I suppose in a way there wasn't enough done to kind of say these weren't meant to be for this. These weren't meant to be for bereavement. They're meant to be for somebody facing their own death. And even in that area, if anyone's listening to this, people are caring for someone who is facing their own death. Even for them, the stages of grief don't always ring true either. We are all individuals. We're all unique, and for that reason, we have unique responses to loss and responses to trauma, and that's what makes the world a great place, because we're all very individual. But I suppose trying to write a prescription for it can be difficult.
Yeah, thanks for that, Helen. So moving on to one of the other myths about grief is the notion of letting go or getting over somebody or moving on. So letting go is a word that we hear a lot. I remember I was invited to lecture some master's students, nothing to do with bereavement, but in healthcare. And I was asked to prepare a class on grief and letting go. And I was horrified. I think it was our friend Dr. Freud who introduced the importance of grieving and then letting go or moving on. But he changed his mind about this. Would you speak about that, please, Helen?
So I suppose when you say the words letting go, I'm saying to myself, what exactly do we mean by letting go? So does letting go mean, for example, being able to live your life as if this person never mattered to you, which clearly is not what it should mean? I think letting go is a very medical concept because it means getting better. That's how I think about what the term in that context means of letting go. And actually, I don't think the people who we really love, people who really mean something to us, we never let go of them. And I don't say that in a negative way, because I think it's a very positive thing. But what I mean is that as soon as you form a relationship with somebody, so think of a mother who has a baby or a father who has a child, and that child's born. And as soon as you see that child, you start to, in the womb for the mother, they're already having that relationship. But you have that relationship, and it's been strengthened. It's been, it's a bond that's been developed there, a bond that nobody can really break ever. So when someone dies, we have bonds with people when they die. We don't ever really break those bonds, but they change. And what I mean by that really is that as soon as somebody is in your life and they really matter to you and you love them, you can never, even if they go out of your life, either because they die or because the relationship ends for some reason or other, you will still carry them with you in your heart. You never lose, because they have influenced how you are as a person. So their influence lives on even after they die. And I think of my father who died in 1979. He's 40 years dead this year, and he is as important to me today as he was then, but in a different way. What I mean by that is that if something happens in my life, like something really good happens, like when I have my children, or if I got a degree, or I got some big success, I'd say I wish my dad was here to hear this. And when something went wrong, I'd say I wish he was here, that he would help me. So that he's never out of my life, not in a constant reminder, not in a way that's distressing to me, but he is still very much present to me, even though he's been absent for 40 years. So I think the presence of somebody you love never goes out of your life. I think that's and I would say of all the things that I've worked with clients over the years, in terms of, trying to come up with ways of being with bereavement that makes life better for people. Like the thing that's made the most difference It's this idea of still having a relationship with somebody even though they've died. And it's not the relationship you had when they were alive, it's a different kind of relationship. So it's a relationship where having had them in your life is really important so that their influence lives on. And I think you probably heard me talking before about this idea. I truly believe this, probably based on experience more than any theories or anything. I think we are all creating legacies when we're here. And I think the people who've died before us that are important to us have left us a legacy. And now we're creating another legacy and carrying that on. And so I think when we die, we leave that legacy behind us. Not thinking in terms of money or material goods. I'm thinking in terms of actually just the influence we leave in the world after us. And people who I was a great admirer of Leonard Cohen, and I listened to his music for many years. And even though he died, and I was really sad about that, when I listen to his music, I can be transported to another place. I think a relationship is a bit like that. When you really think about someone that was really important to you, you can be transported back to that time. And there can be a lot of comfort in that for a lot of people, particularly after the immediate pangs of grief pass. So maybe after the first or second year pass by, and you start thinking about the person and what they meant to you, there can be a lot of comfort in that because you know that to feel loved by somebody, whether they're dead or alive, is a powerful thing. And when you have felt love from somebody, and even if they die, that love doesn't die, it just changes. So I really believe that we have, I don't think we ever let go, and I don't think we should let go. But that doesn't mean we don't carry on and we don't live our lives. But letting go means, are we getting rid of the person? I don't think we ever would need to, or it would be a good idea to get rid of the person you love or your life.
There's so much in what you just said there, Helen. I have a ton of questions I've jotted down. But I'd love to just go back to Freud, the originator of the letting go idea or moving on. And he published papers, early last century that were distributed around the world, and people are still being informed by them, I guess. But then his daughter died, and he soon realised that what he had written about, you must grieve and then move on, or grieve and then let go, it was the last thing he wanted to do as a bereaved parent. The last thing he wanted to do was move on or let go of his daughter. So he very much retracted that theory of letting go. Like generally, when we're bereaved, when someone we love dies, we want to hold their memory as close to us as we possibly can.
I think this is one thing that's changed in bereavement research, and it's a really powerful and a very good thing, which is that when we were writing about bereavement in the early, say, 20th century, and even before that, we were writing from a very academic viewpoint. So we're writing about some things that we haven't really experienced ourselves. And of course, we hadn't really talked to a lot of grieving people. The big sea change in bereavement research came about when people started to do studies and bigger samples of bereaved people. And because we were talking to bereaved people, they were able to tell us, no, actually, this is what's really like. I don't want to let go of this person. So Freud is writing, and of course, the other thing is that his seminal paper, which was published in 1919, I think. The big thing about that paper is that he was writing that about one patient to try and explain why she had gone on to develop depression. And I think he felt that she may have developed depression because she'd unresolved grief. And so I guess from a very medical point of view, the thing was to solve that, you had to let go. But unfortunately, I think that's just a very, very narrow view of grief. And even though I'm not saying, again, great debt of gratitude to Freud, because he was talking about grief and loss, and he was bringing that to the forefront, that could go wrong, and that's important. But I think, unfortunately, when you really talk to grieving people, and across cultures this is the case, we're being told very clearly by people who have been through that experience of grief. And we've all been through grief in one way or another. We know what works for each of us individually. And I go back to what I said already. As long as you're not harming yourself or anybody else, I think it's pretty safe, whatever you do. So I just think we can't, the idea that, that I think letting go originally was about cure. So it was about curing grief. So if you let go, you cured it. I actually don't think it's a cure for grief. I don't think there should be a cure for grief. Because I think that you know somebody and you love them and they loved you, that relationship endures even when one person is absent. But not in a way that's unhealthy. There are ways of enduring relationships, but in a healthy way you can carry that person with you.
Yeah, lovely. Finding a way to just embroider it into the fabric of our lives.
Exactly, yeah. So I always tell this story because I think it's funny to tell it, and I think it highlights what I'm saying. And that is like when you're in your late teens or early 20s, and someone says, "Oh, you're just like your mother or father when you do that," and you hate being reminded that you might be like your parents. And then when you get older and they've died, you might say, if someone says you're quite like your mother when you do that, you might get some solace out of it because you might want to be like her now because it's a later time in your life. So I think our relationships change all the time. But I think we carry people with us in all kinds of ways. Like even I can think back to relationships I've had in the past. They're still not the most important thing in my life, but I would still think, God, that was really good when that happened in that relationship. Like, I really liked that. And I think it's like building blocks of experience, and you're putting one block on top of the other. But at the core of it all, it's a very circular motion, I think, because at the core of it all is this belief in ourselves that we are basically good people who, can love people and we can be loved back. And all relationships are about love for me. Like, I think that's often why we're in relationships, because we like giving, but we also like receiving. And I think when someone dies, that doesn't stop. It just changes the shape. So, there's this really big theory now on grief, particularly in terms of kind of living with grief, called continuing bonds. And the continuing bond theory is all about how do you still have a relationship with somebody even though they're no longer physically in the world. I think that has been a huge addition, because a lot of my clients that I work with would find great comfort in the idea that, I can still have a relationship with this person. Not the one I want. I'd love them to be here. I'd like them to hear their voice at the end of the phone. But even though they can't be here, I can still have this relationship. And I think that's a very powerful thing.
And it takes time to figure that out. I mean, doesn't it, Helen? It takes time to figure out where they are now in our heart. Where can we find them? How do we talk to them now? What new shape does this relationship have? I mean, we can't go from a relationship with someone who's alive to automatically a new relationship with somebody who's dead. It's a process, and it takes time to get there.
And I think it's very important to realise, it's a very good point, because I think that this work that we're talking about in terms of continuing bonds and still having a meaningful relationship with somebody even though they've died, that is something that happens later in bereavement. So in the early days of grief, it's probably in the first 6, 9, 12 months, even up to 18 months, people are very much like just, often go through the motions of living, and often would feel like, I've no interest in anything, I've lost my motivation, I don't want to talk to anybody, I'm upset with myself and the world and everybody around me. And often that's just going through the throes of grief. So this work we're talking about in terms of continuing bonds is work that comes much later, when you can actually afford to take out the grief and look at it and think, okay, well, what actually does that mean to me? And that, for a lot of people, that is 2-3 years into grieving before they do that. So it is later. It is late. And in fact, if somebody came in for counselling and the first thing the counsellor says to them was, let's talk about the continuing bond, most clients would just get very cross, because they want to think, I've got to process what happened to me, I've got to go through the grief, I've got to feel it, I've got to do lots of crying maybe, or maybe I might do a lot of giving out about something. So you have to do all that work first, and then you can think about, how am I going to carry this person with me now into the future?
Helen, something else I'm picking up on there, when we started, you said that you're 40 years working with grief, and... Yeah,
too long probably.
You also said that your father is 40 years dead. I'm wondering, is that coincidence or by design that you're doing what you do?
No, it's coincidence, because he got sick when I was in the middle of my undergraduate studies, and so he died the year I graduated. But even at that point I had decided, I want to go into the area of grief and loss. I've always been really interested. I think probably going back to when I was a child myself, because I come from the west of Ireland, and in the west of Ireland we had a tradition of having wakes at home, which is where you bring the body home and you lay it out in the house or the place where the person lived. And when I was about 5, my grandmother died, and obviously she was waked in our house. And my dad said to me, do you want to say goodbye to your granny? And I had a clue, of course, as a kid. But I can remember he said to me, give her a kiss. And she was obviously freezing cold because she'd been dead a day or so. And I remember thinking to myself, God, what's all this about? And that thought stayed with me. And I suppose I would have seen my mother being very upset at that time after her mother died. So I think I've always been fascinated by kind of the whole response to grief. And I think it's about a real desire to kind of, to really hammer home that idea that like grief is a really unique individual thing, and that it's not a one size fits all. And I think over the years I've been in situations where people can really think they're the expert on your grief and tell you what works for them. And like, it's the one time in your life when you're kind of public property, everybody has kind of an opinion about how you should be. And I think that can be unhelpful, because everyone has their own way of grieving. There's no right way to grieve. So I've taken it as part of my work as a psychologist. I'm always telling people, you follow your gut instinct. If you feel like I've had clients who've gone to the graveyard at 12 o'clock at night, and people think that's a sign of a really unhealthy grief. And yet, that's what they wanted to do. They weren't harming anybody. They weren't afraid to go to the graveyard. So that's what works here. I don't think we should be too prescriptive. What I would really say to people, perhaps people listening to this who are going for counselling, is that the counsellor will give you guidelines. They can tell you what's okay or not okay. They're trained in grief. They're meant to know about the basics around what a good grief response is and what a more difficult grief response is. What's normal and what's maybe not so normal. So, for example, when we look at grief here, we think about things like, has this person got a lot of guilt? Have they got a lot of anger? Have they really lost their motivation to live and think like I've no interest? And how long have they been like that? So when you're early in your grief, a lot of people have very strong feelings and they're completely normal. But if you're still having those feelings 3 or 4 years later and you're really not picking up the threads of your life, you're not really motivated to do very much stuff like you did before, you really have to think to yourself, this is going on a bit long and it shouldn't be this intense at this point. So for me, it's the kind of interaction of how intense are the feelings and how long have they been there. That's what I always look at in terms of assessing who someone's grief is. And if somebody has very intense feelings, and they've had them for a long time, I would certainly be concerned about a grief going on. But I think early in grief, they're really normal. So this is what I say really, all feelings are normal in grief, depending on how long they've had them and how intense they are.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, so I think that for me, that's a very kind of simple way of assessing your own grief. Because, if you're 2 or 3 years post a loss event, and it's still really defining how your life is, if you're still deciding, what makes you decide, will I get up in the morning or will I stay in bed? Will I bother doing this? Will I answer that phone call? Will I go out for coffee with my friends? If that's all being predicated on your response to loss, it probably means that you're getting a bit stuck in your grief. And we know now, we know that complicated grief is a real feature in some people's lives. So I suppose making it okay for them to say, actually my grief is gone a bit wrong and I need some help for it. Because for a long time there was a stigma attached, like if you didn't get over your grief. There was this huge push to make people better very quickly. And, and a lot of people struggled with I'm actually not getting over it. So it's a very real thing that people have to be encouraged to realise people's grief does go wrong, and if it does, there's help there.
Helen, I'd love to ask you to talk a little bit more about continuous bonds and ways that people find to forge a continuous bond with their loved one. You did mention that it can be down the line when a lot of the acute grieving process has happened that people begin to search for that new relationship with their deceased loved ones.
So I've been very privileged over the years of my work to meet people that I've been able to do that work with, and I guess people always surprise and delight me in the ways they come up with having a continuing bond. We'll go through chronologically. So I guess a lot of older people whose parents die often will go back to the place they lived with that parent when they were younger. So they might go back to the countryside where they lived, the house where they lived. They might conjure up the memories around that time. A lot of people would do things like, if you ever noticed actually, if you go into a bookshop and you look at the section on children and loss and grief, you'll often find a lot of parents write books when their children die. And this is a way of having a continuing bond. Because the fear for a lot of parents is that my child died, who will remember them? So the fear of forgetting is a huge thing for a lot of parents because they think, I will remember my child, but who else will remember? So often people have continuing bonds in that way. Sometimes people do things like plant a tree. Some very simple things. I suppose the whole ritual around sometimes people call their children after the name of the parent who died. That's a continuing bond for a lot of people. Sometimes people really would do things like go to places that evoke memories and then have a conversation with the person who died. They also have a continuing bond because they might really like those traits in themselves that person who died had. So if somebody says, your father was really generous, or your mother was a really great cook, or whatever the story is, or they really loved reading. Then when we are doing that activity ourselves, we think like this actually makes me feel close to my parents who died because actually I'm doing the same things they did. And all of those kind of legacy things that we do really make us have continuing bonds with people when they die. And what is a continuing bond? For me, a continuing bond is really saying, you're physically gone out of the world. I can't hear your voice in present time. I can look at a picture, but I can't see you. But when I have a continuing bond, what I'm saying is a really important relationship with you, but it's a relationship where you're physically absent, but emotionally very present. So for me, a lot of continuing bonds is about being emotionally present to the person who's died. So their emotional presence is as big as if they were, almost as if they were really in the world. Because, for example, you may have had this experience yourself. If something big happened in my life, as happens to all of us all the time, I might say to myself, my father was here, how would he advise me to do about this? For me, that's a continuing bond, because I'm thinking, I'm relying on what I knew about him. And thinking back to he'd be a really good influence in my life if he was here. Or I might say, if my mother was here, what would she tell me to do about this? Or my best friend, or whoever it is that's died, doesn't really, if that's a really, really important relationship in my life. When I'm really in bother, I can remember being very traumatized a good few years ago about something that happened. And I remember thinking to myself, when I was, when I was in the throes of it, I was saying to myself, I was saying to my father, if you're around, you better help me. I didn't rely on God. Or you ever notice, for example, I suppose in Ireland we have this tradition of having a strong religious belief around death and dying. But when people often say to me now, when if someone close to them has died, they say, I don't pray to God, I pray to the person who died, because I feel they're in heaven or they're somewhere where they can mind me. So that continuing bond is that kind of stuff that you're very much influenced by having known them in the first place, and by the belief that these people are good people in my life, and therefore I do not let go of them. So it's the exact opposite of what we talked about, letting go. I mean, it's a way of continuing on, but in a healthy way.
And I think it's quite cultural as well, isn't it? Because there are some cultures who do continuous bonds really well. I'm thinking of the Mexicans, Dia de los Muertos, and how they celebrate their deceased loved ones and talk to them, and they have photographs up everywhere, and they include them in their everyday lives and very much carry their legacies forward with them.
But I think as well that's because I think in Western culture we have very much this cut-off point between being dead and being alive. And of course that is two different states of being. But I think in Mexico, what you're talking about there, the Day of the Dead, it's very much like continuation. It's just that they don't see it they don't see it as this huge thing where you're completely removed from life as they know today. You're still part of that life even though you've died. That's one of the biggest differences in terms of culture. I mean, we can learn a lot from both Eastern culture, we've a huge amount to learn in terms of the whole thing around just how we think about death and dying. It's a very big topic, and we always, of course, we're human, so we always think the way we see the world is the right way. But in fact, there are lots of different ways of seeing death and dying and bereavement that we don't think about at all.
Agreed, and we're probably only scratching the tip of the iceberg here as well. Hopefully the way our children will cope with grief and loss in 30 years will be a big improvement on how we do it these days.
Yeah, but I think one of the big, huge improvements is that I really do think we've embraced the idea of kind of talking more. And I think that it's much more permissible now to actually say things like, I'm sad. Because before it was almost like there was pressure on to hide the sadness. And I think as well as social media is going to have a huge influence on how we grieve. The whole thing about, the whole area of kind of, being able to use social media as a way of grieving, For example, there's a company, I think in Ireland, that allows you to watch a funeral remotely if you're in a different country, so that even though you may not be at it, so that you have a presence at it even though you're not in the country. I mean, they're all really innovative, new technological ways of grieving that are going to have a huge influence on how we grieve.
Yes, and we've seen the consequences over the last few decades, the consequences of not grieving openly and not talking and not taking care of our health and grief. The consequences are too significant. I mean, people get sick, people can die.
And I think it's really important, actually, because I think for a long time, the kind of whole bereavement care piece was an add-on. It was like a luxury, that we didn't realise that grief and loss. Like if you think about grief and loss and its central place in our lives, in some ways we're having losses from the time, we're kind of born. Because when you come out of the womb, that is a change in our life. It's a lost situation. You're losing that very safe, warm place to be, and you're going into this world, and even though your parents are there to guide you and mind you and everything, but it is a change, and every loss is an adaptation. And I suppose that's one of the ways of looking at grief and loss now, is that it's a time of huge adaptation, and we know that some people are better at adapting than others. So we really have to think about, and I guess when I was growing up, grief and loss, you just didn't talk about it. You just literally didn't even acknowledge it. Hardly it happened. And there were so many hidden losses. A woman had a miscarriage. There were all kinds of griefs that, just weren't spoken about. And that's completely changed. Now, that can only be for the good. We've changed a lot over the years, and we're learning all the time. We are getting better at it. Maybe sometimes we're slowly, but we are.
So I'm just aware that we're coming up on our time together, Helen. I come from Dublin, and it wasn't a big tradition here. We're often quite death adverse here too. We buried our dead and got on with it. But I know that in other parts of Ireland, where there is a culture of waking the dead, there's a much healthier approach to death.
So I suppose I would have gone to wakes when I was I would have been brought to wakes when I was a child myself, and I've gone to lots of wakes. When I was doing my study on bereavement, the reason I became interested in wakes was because part of that study was that I tracked a group of men and women who were being bereaved, and I tracked them over the 4 years after their bereavement. And one of the things that came out of the research, incidentally, wasn't a big part of the research, but it came out as a real finding, which was that people who had opted to have a wake at home, and the wake, to explain what it is to people, is really where you bring the body back to the house the person lived, and you lay them out at home, and you spend time with that body, and the neighbours would normally come in, and friends and family would come in. They would spend time in the room where the person was laid out, and there would be tea and sandwiches and just time. In fact, the wake is all about time. So there would be a lot of time for telling stories and reminiscing about what that person who died, things they would have done. And I think that is one of the core things about the wake, is that it gives people time. So I would have talked to people over the years who said to me, my dad died, and I went back he was waked at home, and I went back and I met neighbours or friends that I wouldn't have met otherwise unless there was a wake at home. So give them time to hear the stories. And so in my study, what I found out was that people who had opted to have a wake at home, which was about 25% of the sample, they actually had lower levels of depression, they had lower levels of intense grief, they had better coping skills, and I guess less anxiety, people who had opted not to have a wake at home. So that made me think about it. And I guess, I don't know, why was the wake helpful? And I think it's for that reason, that if people felt it gave them time to start to process what happened, and also not to be rushed. We tend to rush through grief sometimes. Somebody dies on a Monday, and maybe they're buried by Wednesday or Thursday. And even though there can be practical reasons why that's the case, sometimes it's not always to the betterment of the grief part of it. So I guess time is a really important thing. And I don't say this, I don't think the wake is for everybody by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that sometimes it was a very old tradition we have in this country, and I think there was a place for it. And in our busy lives, the busy schedules we have, where we don't have time for things, that time is a really big factor in grief and loss. So I think if you start there as soon as the death happens, and the person is laid out at home, if that's possible, and it's what the relatives want and the family want, I think that can be a really powerful time for the bereaved to kind of really start to process what happened. And just, maybe this is a cultural thing, but in Ireland, we particularly I suppose in the west of Ireland, maybe more so in the east, we have a tradition of going to funerals. And it's amazing, actually. I'm always amazed when someone says to me, I know exactly who was at the funeral. So they might know the name of everybody, but they'll know who wasn't at it as well. Of course, at the time of grief, we're very sensitive anyway. We're very sensitive, so we're very aware of what's going on around us. So I think that it's an amazing phenomenon. So I do think the wake has a place. If it suits people, it suits everybody. But it does suit, it's brilliant.
It's a lovely message that you're giving there, Helen, about taking time. Like, I know that's one of my regrets when my mother died nearly 14 years ago now. We went straight from her death to making calls, letting people know, organising and planning, letting everyone know that she died. And I really regret not just sitting there with her for a while and being in the moment and, being in that transition space with her and honouring that sacred space. And since then, when I would have friends who are accompanying someone in death, I'd always say to them, if there's one thing I wish I had done differently, it would have been to turn off the phone and just be there with them for a while, before jumping into that instrumental mode of planning.
And I think as well, it's a bit like people say to me, sometimes when they're really grieving very badly, say, I'm terrified that if I start to cry, I won't stop, that it'll be like a dam bursting and there'll be no control over it. And actually, I think that crying has a level of its own. When you've cried enough, you'll stop, and it actually isn't scary. People don't really believe that, because if you think when we're growing up, maybe we're not encouraged to cry or express ourselves like that. It's the same at the time at the funeral. If you spend X amount of time with someone who's died, and you spend it in their presence in terms of being with them after they've died, the will do I find its own level. So after a while, I've done enough of this now. And of course, the thing is that if you look at, that's a whole other area in grief. If we look at gender differences in grief and how people respond to grief, like women tend to be more, want to talk about it and express their feelings. And men often go down the more traditional route of kind of problem solving and being busy, especially immediately after a death. So like often that time that you don't get to spend is time you can really start to process, what's just happened to me here. And it's a profoundly sad time. But I mean, I think really sadness is the price you pay for love. So like if you really love somebody and they're really important in your life and they go out of your life because they die or because the relationship finishes or whatever, I think sadness is a really important part of that journey, but through your sadness you're saying, I really love this person and now they're not here and I really miss them. And so being sad is very healthy. We associate sadness with some kind of a negative outcome, which it isn't at all. And that's so that's how we're all pushed to hide it, to get through as quickly as possible and rush through it. And in fact, we should really just be taking our time, because it will find its own level, it won't overwhelm us.
Yeah, I see people who are terrified of their emotions, and they feel, exactly as you say there, that if I start to let my emotions be expressed, I don't know where it'll lead to, because this isn't a landscape that I'm used to, and I'm afraid that, I'll never stop if I open up. But of course, all emotions come and go, like the weather. They come in, they express themselves, then they move on, making space for the next thing. Like there's always change. We can be certain of that. Nothing will stay, including whatever difficult emotion we have.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, nothing stays the same. Nothing lasts forever. And there's a lot of hope in that, because I think the idea, like, and on the darkest days of grief, when people are really at their lowest day, where they're thinking, I don't want to be like this. I don't want to be in this place where I'm really sad all the time. I think to be able to give someone even the smallest piece of hope that this will get better is a powerful message. And I do think my experience after all those years is that for the majority of people, things do get better. So I think it's really important to realise that you can be hopeful about that, because I think hope is one thing we all have to hang on to.
Well, Helen, thank you so much for your time. There's been so much in this conversation.
I hope it's helpful.
Well, I'm really looking forward to getting it out there, because I know it will be.
Listen, best luck with it. Mind yourself.
Take good care, Helen, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Shapes of Grief. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice. If your grief is making you unwell, please do go to your healthcare provider. Grief is a normal part of being human. You are not alone. Join the Shapes of Grief community in our private Facebook group and find more support and useful links on shapesofgrief.com. Until the next time, from me, Liz Gleeson, stay well.